Hi, everyone, and welcome to Adapting Literacy Services, Considerations for Reaching Vulnerable Populations in Times of Crisis. This is part of the Education and Vitality Forum. So this event is put on by the Interlevel Educational Table, which is a committee of Concordia University's Quebec English-speaking communities research network. And funding for this conference comes from the Secrétariat aux Relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. I'm Laura Thompson, and I'm the project manager at Literacy Quebec. So now I will introduce our panelists. And first we have Margo Legault. She's the executive director at Literacy Quebec. Literacy Quebec is an umbrella organization representing 13 members, local literacy councils across the province. Margo holds university degrees in commerce and law, and she holds a master's in human rights from the National University of Ireland in Galway. She has focused her career on advocating for the improvement of economic, social, and cultural rights of marginalized populations, and this year marks her 10th year as the executive director of Literacy Quebec. So next we have Wendy Seys, who is the executive director at Yamaska Literacy Council, which is a community-based literacy organization in the Eastern Townships, and they also happen to be a member of Literacy Quebec. Wendy has worked and volunteered in the adult literacy field since 1989, and she has a BA from the University of Toronto and an MA in Educational Studies from Concordia. She serves on the board of directors of Literacy Quebec, the Knowlton Literary Festival, and the Eastern Townships Adult General Education Governing Board. So to begin, I will hand things over to Wendy for an overview of the literacy landscape here in Quebec.
Next slide. Next slide. One more. So we thought, given that we didn't know what audience would be with us today, that we would start off by talking about what is literacy. There is no one single definition of literacy, but there is a definition that we often work with in the adult literacy fields. So literacy, as you are probably aware, is a lot more than just being able to read and write. The way we look at literacy now is how we are able to understand, evaluate, use, and engage with written text to participate in society. So that's a lot more complicated. The way we measure literacy, the way we define it is not as straightforward as being able to read or not being able to read. So we use literacy skills every day in various aspects of our life. We use them at home every day. Here are some examples of how we use them. We use them in the workplace and in the workforce. We use them to participate in different civic things such as voting and participating in community organizations, volunteering, absolutely. And we also use them to navigate our health, and that has become even more critical in the last year and a half as we navigate the pandemic. So literacy skills are not something we just use in a classroom. We use them in every aspect of our life to navigate the world around us. So we no longer talk about whether someone can read or not, whether somebody is literate or not. We look at literacy skills as they are measured on a scale. The scale that we use is based on below level 1 to a level 5. Level 5 is high, below level 1 is low. The little pictograms here are just an example of if you were somebody whose reading level was at a level 1 or below level 1, you might rely more on the pictures and less on the actual text. The text, you may recognize a few words, but you wouldn't rely on the text to get your information. Somebody at reading at level 3 would be able to use the text as well as the image. There might be some gaps in the text, maybe not full understanding, but they would have some mastery of it. And then when we talk about levels 3 to 5, those are people that are managing to decode, managing to understand. So really when we talk about literacy, we're talking about level 2 and below. So those are what we would consider low literacy. So many people are surprised to hear that we have a literacy problem. So I think this is an evident answer is yes, there is a literacy problem. So what does that mean? What does it look like? In Quebec, the most recent research, which is the PIAC research, indicates that 1 out of 5 adults between the ages of 16 and 65 years struggles with low literacy. So that's almost 20% of the population. So this diagram gives you a little bit of an idea of what that looks like. So we're talking about 2.5 million people in Quebec. On levels 4 and 5, you can see that the percentage is quite low for people that are reading at the highest levels. And that's because the tasks that are required to read at those levels are quite complex. So this PIAC research is the first research that actually, ironically, measured people who were below level 1. In previous research studies, there were people that couldn't read who didn't even qualify to take the test to see how they scored. So that's interesting. And also technology, problem solving in a technology rich environment is really part of how we measure literacy now. So if somebody has low literacy, it doesn't mean that they're going to experience all of these effects with it, but low literacy can be attributed to, connected to many of these issues. And having worked in a prison for a long time, we do hear from people who are incarcerated that many of them did struggle in school, and literacy is a big issue. So the key points that we don't talk about people being illiterate anymore. We use the term low literacy. We talk about literacy as something that falls along a scale. It's not linked to a single threshold. We're living in a time where the information culture requires higher levels of literacy than ever before. We also know that reading, like exercise, is a use it or lose it skill. So the more you practice it, the stronger it becomes. So during the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, adults of all ages had their learning interrupted, and literacy was absent from many national response plans. Literacy programs scrambled to adapt their services, which is what we're here to talk about today. But definitely there was the rapid switch to online learning created a digital divide in which many adult literacy learners lack the skills and the technology and the infrastructure to engage with learning.
Thanks, Wendy. So I'll talk a little bit about Literacy Quebec and the things that we've adapted throughout the pandemic. So first off, who's Literacy Quebec? Literacy Quebec is a network that connects and represents community-based literacy organizations, and that is to empower people, impact lives, and build a stronger society. The types of support that we offered during the pandemic are really, we documented the effects of the pandemic on the literacy network. We also talked about raising awareness about the digital divide and access to internet. We also provided services to break isolation of literacy practitioners and create a community of practice. And we offered training and professional development to assist in the adaptation of services. So documenting the effects, the way that we did that is that we conducted surveys to our member organizations. We had 2 surveys and 2 COVID reports, and they were disseminated broadly. And they really showed the impact of the pandemic on on organizations, on their volunteers, as well as on their learners. And really what we saw is that it was really a challenge to be learning remotely, not coming into the center, but I'll leave that more for Wendy to discuss. And having those reports and documenting the effects were really a great way to be able to share with government, with donors, with funders, with key stakeholders, the challenges that were faced by the literacy network. When we're talking about raising awareness, it's really advocacy. The digital divide is real and it's always existed, but it has been accelerated by the pandemic. The UN, the UN General Assembly in 2016 had already passed a resolution saying that internet is a human right. And so we have seen that, it's really been a lifeline throughout the pandemic, but that many Canadians and Quebecers have been struggling to access it. The federal government talks about universal broadband, but that'll only come into effect by 2030, which isn't a long time. And once that infrastructure is in place, not everyone will be able to afford it. There's also not only questions about cost, but given that people use the internet for education, for work, accessing government services, we need to look at the adequate speed that would be available at affordable rates. There's also a question about accessing devices and the digital literacy skills required to actually use the internet. The last thing that we advocated for was an emergency fund for literacy networks, and that was able to allow them to adapt their services, also cover some of the costs of the PPE and additional adaptations that were needed to their physical space. And as we've seen, there's been an increase in demand for literacy services over the pandemic, even though during lockdown and everything, people thought, well, the services are going to slow down. They actually increased. So we supported our network, which was reaching adults with low literacy. We really, our monthly meetups became weekly meetups, and we created a community of practice because everyone wanted to know how everyone else was adapting. We also provided monthly professional development because as you're learning how to work remotely or whatever the case may be, even managing workflows remotely, people needed to have additional training. And so we were able to help with that. And offering individualized support really gave us an ear on the ground about what was happening. And now I'm going to pass you over to Wendy, who will actually talk about that grassroots experience of trying to reach adult learners during a pandemic.
I work as the Executive Director of the Yamaska Literacy Council, and we are a member organization of Literacy Quebec. And I'm here really to share sort of one lived experience of a literacy organization during the pandemic. By no means are we the poster child for how to adapt to a pandemic. We are still trying to adapt. We've had challenges, and we've done what we've been able to do. So that's really what I wanted to share. So our mission is to enrich lives through literacy, and our mandate is to work in 2 MRCs of the Eastern Townships, reaching English-speaking adults and older youth. Our programs primarily consist of one-on-one tutoring, which traditionally has been our largest program, but really took a hit during the pandemic. We also offer a scribe service for people that need help filling out documents, understanding forms, accompaniment to find different services in the community. We also do a number of different programs around family literacy, digital health, and financial literacy programming. We train volunteers as literacy tutors, and we also have a mandate to promote and do advocacy in the community. So that's our territory. It's quite a large territory. Some of you might recognize some of the communities as places you come to ski, such as Bromont and Sutton. We go all the way down to the Vermont border. So we cover a huge territory, and we cover a territory that is not necessarily well connected to the internet. So when the pandemic hit, like many organizations, it sort of happened overnight. We shut our doors initially. We scrambled to figure out what to tell our members. We had always sort of not prided ourselves, but our hallmark had always been that our one-on-one face-to-face tutoring was what made the difference for adult learners who had not been successful in a classroom, who had struggled, many of who have attention issues, concentration, difficulty with executive function. So, we were serving a population pretty much face-to-face, and that all had to stop in the pandemic. And our first reaction probably was, how are we going to get everybody online? But I think it's important, that we stood back and we listened to what people were saying, because in our situation, not everybody wanted to go online or felt that they were capable of it. So these were the kinds of comments that we had from our learners. We also have a volunteer workforce that is predominantly seniors, and not all of our volunteers are digital natives either. So not only would we have to, or did we have to, look at how our adult learners could access technology, we also had to consider our volunteers, many of whom were reluctant to jump right in and do some technology tutoring. Zoom fatigue became a very real reality. So what had been our main one-to-one tutoring, and one-to-one really for us was in the same room side by side, we had very few one-on-one matches that continued online. We did have some that managed still to talk on the phone, that would deliver materials to their students' door, and then they would talk on the phone and they would work on them together. We had about 30% of our students and tutors are in a federal prison. The prison closed its doors, and we had no way other than sending in letters, notes, newsletters to reach that population. And many of our volunteers participate because there's the social aspect of getting together and meeting their tutor. So that one-on-one tutoring really took a hit. So we had to look at other ways of meeting the need. We did a lot of online workshops, recognizing that there were certain areas where people were struggling. All the time that, our tutoring wasn't happening, our phones were ringing, we were getting questions. How do I find services? How do I order my groceries online? What's the latest recommendation? Am I allowed to go to church? We had a lot of people just phoning about general everyday questions because they couldn't navigate the requirements online. So we had a lot more people participating in our different workshops. So we were reaching them through digital literacy. And normally where our accompaniments are probably quite minimal. We had over 250 requests for assistance, for people, can you put me in touch with Emploi Quebec? I need to go back and train. I've lost my job, all those kinds of things, technical support. We had a lot of people that wanted to know how to use Zoom, who wanted to know how to use email. So that was really a large part of the kind of work that we were doing in terms of service delivery. So in ways that we adapted, we were able to find some extra funding. Obviously, the personal protective equipment, we got plexiglass for the office. So when people did come in, we've got yellow tape on the floor still and stickers, and we purchased masks and sanitizer and all those things. We engaged a local tech person to provide sort of one-on-one support, for email, for Zoom, and that somebody that was able to book vaccination appointments. A lot of seniors didn't have computers, didn't know how to do that online. And then, the needs kind of changed, and then it became, there was a wave of people that wanted their vaccination proof printed. So we provided a lot of technical support. We knew that there were seniors that were feeling isolated, that were struggling with digital literacy. We knew that mental health was taking a hit. So we created a lot of literacy bags, literacy kits that we delivered to doors that we would put in, tips on using Zoom. Like we would personalize the bags. We, gave people a survey about what their needs were, and we would personalize and distribute bags. We also distributed more than 2,000 books to families, to seniors, to people in the community. And then we had the opportunity to update our website to make it a little bit more user-friendly. We're in the process of putting our resource room online so people can browse the materials without having to come to one of our offices. So these are some of the adaptations that we were able to do during the pandemic. So just as the pandemic hit and the phones were ringing like crazy and everybody was panicking, what are we going to do? And, we were getting phone calls not just from our adult learners, but from our volunteers. And we all know that when people are feeling stressed, anxious, it's more difficult than normal to find information, to understand it, and to use different services in the community. When we're all in panic mode, we just we don't hear, we don't process in the same way. So we had an opportunity to apply for a project. And at the time, it was March 2020, and I knew we wouldn't be getting the funding if we did get it for another 6 months. So I thought, well, in 6 months, this pandemic could be over. But that didn't prove to be the case. But we thought there's a lot of emergency situations where adults with low literacy struggle to get information. So we created an emergency toolkit. We've got a print version and we've got a digital version. And some of the principles that we used when building this, we had a lot of student focus groups to find out what people's needs were. We used a lot of icons. We used a lot of very short sentences. And we have created tools like this in the past to help people navigate. We've done a booklet on health literacy, and we created it for adults with low learners. But when we actually started to distribute it, we had adults with low literacy definitely were using it, but we found that seniors were asking for it. People with low vision were asking for it because it was large print. There was a lot of white space. People that were newcomers to the community were using it. So we used a lot of principles of universal design to create tools that work for adults with low literacy, but we do find that once we create it for that population, it also works for many other populations. So given that we've talked about the statistics and that 1 in 5 people struggles with low literacy, I'll show you a little bit. We've got a short video that I hope works about our toolkit, and maybe it can give you some ideas in your communication with people to use some principles of plain language.
Introducing the Emergency Toolkit, brought to you by the Yamaska Literacy Council, a community-based literacy organization serving English speakers in the Eastern Townships. When there's a crisis or an emergency, you want to get help as soon as possible. The Emergency Toolkit explains how to get help in an emergency. The toolkit provides clear information on emergencies, non-emergencies, and being prepared before an emergency strikes. When there's an emergency, first, take a deep breath and steady yourself. Make sure you are safe. Know your location and find a phone. When you're feeling under the weather, you need to ask yourself, where does it hurt? Is it your body? If it is, you can call 811, Infosanti, and choose option 1. A nurse will answer your health-related questions. Is it your feelings? If it is, you can call 811 InfoSocial and choose option 2. A social worker will answer your emotional well-being questions. If you're not sure, call 211. A counselor will help you find the resources available in your area. When things are going well, take the time to prepare for an emergency. Get your toolkit today. Contact the Yamaska Literacy Council at 1-866-337-7503 or write to us at info@yamaskaliteracy.ca or visit our website www.yamaskaliteracy.ca. We'll send you a print or digital copy.
So that was one tool that we created as a way to adapt and support adults with low literacy in the pandemic. So just to summarize some of the challenges that we faced and continue to face, we did lose some students and volunteers. We don't know if they'll come back. We've tried to stay in touch with people and keep them involved. Lack of internet connectivity skills to function online is still a big challenge for many. And it's been difficult to maintain the connection because people volunteer and they get involved with a community organization for that connection. And when we can't always see them, it's a challenge to find ways to stay in touch. But there have been some opportunities and some successes that have come out of the pandemic. We have been able to meet new kinds of literacy needs, such as health and digital needs. We've been able to create some new tools and resources. It really gave us a chance to pause and think about how we deliver our services, and that our focus on relying on face-to-face put us in a difficult situation during a pandemic. So we've reached new audiences. We've learned, you know, in terms of working offline, in terms of the staff working, we've got some systems set up that if there's another crisis, you know, whether it's who knows what the next one could be, but we've done some emergency preparedness, and we were able to access some new funds for the adaptation. So there are other literacy councils that adapted in different ways. Some of them had more success with the online tutoring per se. I think people who live in more urban communities and maybe have an adult literacy population that is more attached maybe to the adult education centers, or that are, you know, more comfortable using technology, might have had, you know, an easier time of it. So that was our experience.
And then I'll just let you know a little bit about Literacy Quebec's tools that we were able to develop. So first of all, we set up a literacy helpline because, as you know, the pandemic hit and we saw that everything was transitioning to online services, many people were being left behind. So even if you think of the census, you know, normally we would receive the form to fill out and there was an option to fill it out online. This year, by default, you received a notice that said, go online and fill it out. And if you would like to use the actual paper form, you had to call a phone number and enter 11 digits. So for people with low literacy, for seniors, for people with difficulty, you know, with vision issues, this was a challenge. And so we set up this helpline to really go back to basics and reach those people who had a reliance on either print material or on telephone and less sort of high-tech technology. And what we saw is that a lot of people needed help accessing information because they weren't set up at home, you know, to be able to look at these things up on the internet, or during lockdown, there was no way to connect to Wi-Fi. They couldn't go to their local coffee shop or local library and use the Wi-Fi there off of their phones. And so we received about 70 calls since we set up last March, and we helped people with their vaccine appointments. So some people were able to look to book their appointment online, but they weren't sure if they were doing it correctly, if there was just no spots available. They weren't very comfortable online. And we also helped a lot of people they were looking for phone numbers or information of services in their area. And then obviously once the vaccine passports came into effect, there was a lot of calls for QR codes, helping people get their QR codes, figuring out what these things were, how to use them. Some people also needed help printing them. And also people who, you know, just needed literacy services or wanted to upgrade their digital literacy skills, we were able to refer them to our member organizations. And Patrick, I'll just get you to flip to the next slide. So these are the main things that the Literacy Helpline were set up for, and it was really in response to the pandemic, but we're seeing that there is an ongoing need for it, and we will continue to provide the Literacy Helpline. It is all managed by volunteers, so they're all onboarded by Literacy Quebec. They're trained, and they, you know, they're logging all the calls and tracking all of them. But really, it was set up initially for anyone who needed help printing things, and we saw that that was a major issue during the pandemic. People, you know, don't like to look at screens or don't have access to them, and they really want that print material. Understanding written information. A lot of people with low literacy skills, they have a coping mechanism of going to their local community organization or somewhere where there's, you know, a computer lab or somebody, a key person that they can ask these questions without divulging that they can't read the information or don't understand it, but can sort of ask that question where someone will, you know, either explain it to them or do that Google search for them. And then we also had some calls of people who actually wanted to be set up with a device. So they had access to internet, but they just needed help. They were looking to have, you know, a loaning program. So we were able to lend them equipment and actually have a volunteer show them how to use it. The second thing that we set up was Literacy Quebec every year gives a lot of workshops to community organizations, to businesses, to frontline workers about literacy and clear language. So it's all about recognizing the signs that the person that's coming to see you may have low literacy skills, how you can help them, how you can develop materials that are more accessible by using clear language, and some of the tips that were used for Wendy's emergency toolkit, like using more white space, using visuals and images. And so it's an online course that it's free. It takes about an hour to do. Anyone can do it. And we've just found that the feedback has been very well received. And it's just another way of raising awareness about literacy issues without having to have an employer or somebody, a community worker, actually organize that workshop and having someone from Literacy Quebec deliver it. So it's sort of accessible 24 hours a day, and it tracks their progress. So people don't have to sit down for that full hour. They can come and go from it. And they even get a certificate at the end, which people seem to appreciate. And then the last thing that we've done is that we're in the process of creating a crisis management toolkit, because not only the literacy organizations within our network, but the community groups that we work with, we've all noticed that we were not prepared for this crisis. And so we're hoping that this toolkit will not only be useful to literacy practitioners, but also to anyone working in a community organization, so that they can sort of plan for any eventuality, and just have some templates and some checklists that can be used, so that board of directors are prepared and have these decisions in place, and that the staff is really well equipped to respond when these things happen. For Literacy Quebec, we've seen that transitioning to online services has really been great for some people and some service providers and some organizations, but it does leave many people behind. And so we've really been raising awareness about, offering that technical support. Don't assume that people have connections, have devices, and know how to use them. And that's really something that I think a lot of organizations have taken on board and have put things in place in order to be as inclusive and accessible as possible. Really, what we've also seen in the pandemic is that staff, volunteers, adult learners, the resiliency of this group has been amazing, not only in our network, but for all community organizations. So I think that's something that has really shined through the pandemic. And accessible, affordable connectivity is really an issue. It continues to be an issue, and it's something that we continue to advocate for.
I guess community organizations have always had to adapt. We have been, the pandemic challenged us in ways to adapt beyond what we had ever seen before. But I think in terms of the people that we serve as literacy organizations, we work with people who are marginalized in many ways. And really what the pandemic highlighted is that those who were marginalized before the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, they were further, relegated to the margins. So it increased, I think, our role in advocating for those people and serving them.
All right, thank you both. We have a few questions. So going actually back to the very beginning, Wendy. So Carol is asking, when you're talking about literacy, are you talking about English literacy, French literacy? Are those who have a very low level of literacy, does that have anything to do with it not being literate in a foreign language?
Okay, well, the PIAC research was done. People participated in the survey either in French or English, whatever their mother tongue was and whatever they were comfortable. So this is a Made in Canada issue. The statistics reflect Francophones as well as Anglophones. So it's not a matter of somebody coming from another country and not having the language. It's in their mother tongue. They took the survey in that language.
Right. Okay, thank you. And Deb is wondering, given the glaring imbalances and inequalities among the student population, has anything improved since the original challenges that were addressed during the pandemic? And then what's next?
Has anything improved? I think there's more awareness. I think we've had to be more adaptable, and I think a lot of people who may not have had empathy with people that struggle found themselves in situations where they themselves were struggling. I think, we've had to do a lot of working together to get things moving during the pandemic. So has it changed? Has it improved? It's changed for sure. Whether it's improved, I think, is debatable.
All right, I'm going to give you a comment from Lucy. She says, I love the use of pictograms in the video instead of using words because it makes me reflect on the messages that we give some of our students. So thanks for that reflection.
Thank you.
And is there recognition and support for this vulnerable group from the powers that be?
Well, that's a heavy loaded question. I think definitely, when we're speaking to our elected officials or different ministers, one-on-one, they definitely do agree, but sometimes some of the decisions that are making don't, we're kind of thinking like, what? So it's yes and no. There's definitely, I've heard, from different people saying, I don't believe that that's the literacy rate within Quebec, but then on a daily basis, we do see that people struggle with it. So there definitely is an understanding, but some of the programs and services that are put in place are not as accessible as they could be or should be. So there are definitely obstacles to accessing some services that I guess should be tailored more or, made adapted to people who have low literacy, who struggle with literacy and are trying to access them.
So this is kind of a question for both of you. So what has kind of been a best practice or advice for adapting to reach adults with low literacy?
Well, I think I would say the big lesson that we have learned is that you have to adapt in ways that the people that you're reaching want the adaptation. We spent a lot of time, working on trying to get everybody online, where people were telling us that that was not really what they wanted to do. So again, we hear that all the time in the literacy community. Don't do it to them, do it with them. Don't assume you know what's right for them. So let them guide it.
And how do we get government officials and the powers that be to take action and admit that low literacy is a health crisis?
Yeah, that's something that, Literacy Quebec, obviously, as the umbrella organization, we take on this challenge on a daily basis. It is difficult for government to admit that there is an issue, because then that means that, that they haven't done their job, that, somehow people have slipped through the cracks, or so it is very difficult to get any sort of acknowledgement of that. But there are ways of looking at it, when you look at graduation rates, when you look at retention rates. So there are ways of doing it, but I think that it really depends if that actual person is open-minded and is listening to what the community organizations with the education sector is telling them.
Yeah, we really need to work with people to look at things through a literacy lens. We talk about healthcare professionals. One of the biggest, when we did focus groups, one of the biggest things we heard from learners was, I don't want them to know that I can't read. I don't want them to think I'm stupid. And when we talk to healthcare professionals, they would say, it doesn't occur to us. If we don't know, then we can't help. If they don't tell us, then we don't know. Because they're not in the business of adult literacy, and they're in the business of healthcare. So it's kind of that constantly sensitizing, when you come up to an issue, that low literacy is really at the crux of the issue, is to constantly sensitize. So we need advocates, champions for literacy to move the cause forward.
Yeah, and there's also, you know, historically speaking, there's been a huge stigma attached to anyone who, you know, comes out and says that they have low literacy skills or that they struggle with literacy. So I think it's also a societal issue that we need to, you know, not be shaming people who are looking to improve their literacy skills, but really connecting them to the services that are available to them. And that, you know, there's no shame in, you know, wanting to learn and wanting to improve on your skills.
Yeah, I think that was one of the important things, one of the reasons why we decided to talk about statistics, because, you know, 1 in 5 is not an insignificant number. It's not only people that come to literacy programs that have literacy issues. It's people that are, you know, not affiliated with programs, that are, you know, working and living alongside all of us.
All right, I'm going to read a couple more comments, and then if anybody has one last question, feel free to put it in the chat. So Deb says the literacy is a generational issue in as much as a cultural or academic one, hoping we can make some inroads in the future, and let us know what we can do, please.
Who's Deb? Yeah, if we want to let her know, we need to identify yourself, Deb.
And then Emily also says, I see so many parallels to the work we do in adult education centers. Our student populations are definitely dealing with similar struggles. And this is why prevention and early literacy is.
Absolutely. And when, you know, oftentimes we talk to the adult ed centers and the vocational programs, and, you know, we ask, you know, what are the success rates? And oftentimes the dropout rate parallels, you know, kind of the literacy rate. There's kind of an interesting connection between those.
Yeah, the comment about the generational issue is very interesting, because a lot of the adult learners who come to the literacy network to improve their skills, it's only when, you know, they need to help their children with homework, or they want to be able to read to their grandchildren. So it's almost as if they weren't doing it for themselves first, but now it's like it's going to affect somebody else, or they want to be able to engage better. So it's that extra little push that makes them seek out the services.
Yeah, we often hear, I don't want my child to go through what I went through in school.
All right, so Deb says she works in education, all levels, generational pride and insecurity is apparent. So do either of you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
You know, I'm really happy that we were able to talk about literacy as part of the forum, because definitely it's something in the pandemic that I think it's become even more critical. So thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for choosing, you know, to participate in this panel, and, you know, feel free to reach out to Wendy or myself if you want any more information. And the tools that I mentioned, like the helpline and the e-learning course, all the information is available on our website. So if ever you wanted more details, you can go check it out there.
So thank you all very much for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks.